All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming to this Terra.do keynote with Dr. Akshat Rathi. Great to see so many of you today. Just a couple of quick notes as we get started. Like I was saying before, if you can keep your cameras on, that'd be really great. Would love to see your faces as you listen in. Please stay on mute as much as possible so that we can hear our speaker clearly. Welcome to all of you who are joining us from within and also outside of the Terra.do community. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Ashwin Apte, and I am the director of Terra's 12-week flagship course, Climate Change Learning for Action. This talk today is the keynote for the fellows in our newly launched Fossas cohort of Learning for Action. And it is also one of the expert guest talks for the fellows in our ongoing Elephants cohort. So these two cohorts together represent over 300 fellows from more than over 20 countries, and they come from a broad range of professional backgrounds. The Learning for Action course itself, it is an intensive exploration of climate science, climate impacts, climate solutions, and it's a combination of written classes, live weekly lab sessions, deep dives, expert guest talks, workshops. All of this intended to help fellows learn about climate change and also help them find their role in working to address it. Terra was founded in 2020 with an ambitious goal of getting 100 million people working on climate change this decade. To achieve this goal, we offer a combination of climate education, connections to employers and climate jobs, and a supportive community of people who want to make a difference on climate change. You can check out our programs at Terra.do on the web, and you can download our app from the Apple App Store and also from Google Play. We offer a new cohort of the Learning for Action flagship course every 6 weeks, and we urge you to check it out if you want to learn more about how you can become involved in addressing climate change. Our next cohort begins November 27th. An overview of how today's session will go. I'll start with introducing Akshat and hand over to him for brief remarks. Kamal and I have curated a set of questions which we'd love for Akshat to answer, so I'll put those questions to him next, and then we'll move to audience Q&A. Now for audience Q&A, we are only taking questions from the current fellows of LFA, so the current fellows of the Fossas and the Elephants cohorts. And we'll be using Slido to curate these questions. Fellows of the current cohorts, Fossas and Elephants, you can find that Slido link in a message about this talk in your cohort Slack channel. All right, I'll quickly get going, and I'll start by introducing a speaker. So Akshat Rathi is a London-based senior reporter for Bloomberg News. He has a PhD in organic chemistry from the University of Oxford and a BTech in chemical engineering from the Institute of Chemical Technology in Mumbai. Previously, Akshat has been a senior reporter at Quartz and also a science editor at The Conversation. He's also worked for The Economist and the Royal Society of Chemistry before. His writings have been published in many publications, Nature, The Hindu, The Guardian, Ars Technica, Chemistry World, among others, of course. And he has won numerous awards for his work. Too long a list for me to talk about right now. His first book, Climate Capitalism, is out now, very recently. And today's talk is titled Capitalism's Role in Getting Us to Zero Emissions. We'll hear firsthand from Akshat about the work that went into his book and some of the stories he has researched and curated in the book, speaking about people building solutions at scale to tackle one of humanity's greatest challenges, climate change. Now, Kamal really wanted to be here today, but wasn't able to make it. But she asked me to tell you this about Akshat. Here's what she says. As a journalist, he's always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He worked on some of the earliest stories about problems with offsets when offsets were the in thing. He was exploring cutting edge batteries before they were anywhere close to being commercially viable. He's got a real nose for what really matters in climate, and he's committed to doing excellent research and telling great stories. So welcome, Akshat, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, that's a very nice introduction. I'm sorry, Kamal couldn't be here, but yeah, I'll just start with a very brief overview of the book and really want to get into conversation. I think that's where most people will find value. So the book sort of came out of a place where I was, as a reporter, doing the work that I do, and then in the experts and the sort of startup world, the investors, business people, my conversations were very different from when I spoke to readers and audiences. And the biggest gap that I was seeing was that, at least when I started the book, which was in 2019, was that there were clearly a whole set of solutions that were being deployed at scale, but not enough was being talked about in those solutions, especially outside of the US. Climate is a global problem, and the solutions are also global. And so, in the work that I was doing, I was hoping that I'd be able to showcase some of the success stories around the world. Starting with technology, because that's where my background as a scientist and as an engineer comes in handy. That's where I felt I was comfortable in not just absorbing all the technical knowledge, but also being able to then find a way to tell that story that is informed and is educational, not just transcription. So I started with the goal of trying to tell the stories of technologies, and then I realized over the time that I wrote this book, which took about 4 years in all, is that technologies require all these other support structures to be able to really scale. Again, not a discovery per se, that's theory as we know it, but what I found was there were actually structural changes that were happening to enable these technologies to scale. And so that's what the book ended up becoming. It's called Climate Capitalism because it's a provocation, but also it's sort of an acceptance that if we are to do this, we have to do it in the economic system that we have, and you have to tweak it. And actually, there are places all over the world where that tweaking has begun. And so the book is sort of 12 chapters, introduction, conclusion, and then 10 chapters in the middle, and there are technology chapters, and then there are systems chapters. So you get solar in India, you get electric cars in China, you get wind in Denmark. But you also get systems chapters like how did the International Energy Agency get transformed and why that matters? And how did the UK build the Climate Change Act? Where did Breakthrough Energy Ventures come from and why does it have the philosophy it does? And how does it invest in companies? And what can corporations do, existing ones, large ones that have shareholders that need to transform? So I have an example of Unilever versus ExxonMobil. So briefly, that's the book. And the goal of the book was to essentially tell stories of people doing things at scale within the challenges that exist in the energy transition. I'm a scientist by background. I write about climate science, but this is not a book trying to tell you whether climate change is real or not, but it is acknowledging that we're going to live in this two-track world over the next few decades, where because warming is baked into our existence until we reach net zero emissions, the impacts that we are going to see are just going to keep getting worse. But we should not forget there are all these solutions that are starting to scale and that need to scale everywhere on the planet. And taking examples from what works is probably the quickest way we can shortcut to that future.
Thank you for that, Akshat. That was great. I have, I got the chance to read your book, an advance copy. So I already, kind of have some questions for you. You actually start the book pretty much saying it's cheaper to save the world than to destroy it. Well, can a leopard change its spots, do you think? What are your arguments for us to be able to save the world and being cheaper to save the world?
Yeah, it is not something I had to invent. I sort of maybe distilled it in those words, but there are enough studies showing that climate impacts, depending on whichever warming scenario you take beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, or in fact, even with 1.5 degrees Celsius, that the impacts will be trillions and tens of trillions, and then eventually hundreds of trillions of dollars versus if you did tackle the problem. So as a global economic case, that actually has been made for quite some time now. What hasn't been the case is that economic case is first not evenly distributed. The initial trillions that will be lost and are already being lost will be in the US because that's the largest economy and that's where insurance industry exists and that's where all the losses can be measured in the amounts that they are. But it also compares us to a future. So India, over the next 50 years, will become a much, much, much bigger economy, regardless of whether there's climate change or not. But because of climate change, India's economic potential will be reduced, We know that that's going to happen. How much does that potential get reduced is kind of still in our control. And so it's actually, I will find, I mean, I'm going to struggle to find any economist on the planet who knows climate science and who's looked at the subject disagreeing with that sentence. I think what you're getting at with sort of leopard changing its spots is that whether capitalism can do it. And, you know, again, not, this is not to say it's a flippant answer because that's not the goal here, but we do not have an alternative. You know, I start with a Noam Chomsky quote in the very introduction, the famous anti-capitalist who says, look, in the time frame that we have left for what we need to do, you have to make use of the tools that we have. Capitalism is the way for you to scale solutions. So I kind of you know, realize that that's the case. And then all the success stories show you that there are different forms of capitalism that exist. There's a different form in America, in Europe, in India, in China. You know, they're driven by different politics. They're driven by different economic understanding of the future, or what can be feasible within the context in which that country exists. And we can explore that. But it's it is actually a very benign sentence to start the book in, but it's interesting that people find it kind of provocative to start off.
Yeah, benign but powerful is at the same time is how I'd say. So you just you said that the economic case has already been made many times over, and most economists would agree with that. You also talked about how the technology or much of the technology we need already exists, and the stories you tell actually give us examples, concrete examples of these technologies in action, some of them at least. So what next, right? I mean, why is it that we get a feeling that we aren't moving fast enough?
100%. And that I expected that question to come. So one way to think about it is we are actually moving in the right direction. In the world that I have been a climate journalist, 2016 onwards, we have avoided a warming scenario of 4.5 degrees Celsius down to 3 degrees Celsius. Neither of those are good, but one is much better. So let's start there. Progress has been made, but absolutely right that we are not making progress at scale. Emissions are going to hit a new record in 2023, not decline as they must. And so the best way to understand that is actually that even as climate change is a global problem, the solutions to tackling it are very local. So yes, you can have a solar panel built in China that's installed in Europe. That needs to happen. But how exactly that solar panel ends up in that place in Europe is a local problem that needs to be solved. And what we have struggled with is making sure that the local problems are resolved to enable these solutions to actually work at scale. So, you know, by any stretch of imagination, and I've talked to so many analysts over the years, almost all analysts are surprised at the deployment of all green technologies, starting with solar, wind, batteries, electric cars. Surprised because they thought that scaling it is going to be much harder because local problems are so much harder to overcome, not because technology doesn't become cheaper. And so they have been surprised that there has been actually that much deployment. And yet then you compare it to a net zero scenario and we are still ways off in certain technologies. Well, almost everything except solar. Solar is probably the only one we are on track with net zero right now. And so that's where I feel like the gap is missing, where the problem is global, the solutions are local. And that's why, in a way, what Terra.do does, bringing people in to do the work in their own domains, in their own regions, is so important.
Appreciate that, Akshat. While we're talking about the pace of change, right, I quickly wanted to ask you about vested interests in some sense. So in your book, you talk about how there are these three major actors we need for this transformation: technology, policy, and people. And these are continually being shaped by money, power, and politics, right? And we've seen many examples in the past where vested interests with deep pockets, maybe like, for example, the fossil fuel industry, have resisted change and have been able to use money and power to push back against technology and people. How do you see this changing in the future? Like my deeper question here is, aren't the short-term interests of the corporate executives and even shareholders of these companies misaligned with climate action?
They are, and they have been in all this period that we have seen any climate action. So what we have seen is, despite the fact that capitalism as it exists is more short-termist than it needs to be. A story that is not in the book that should have been in the book, but I only learned about it later, is that the quarterly financial projections that every publicly owned company does now wasn't the norm 50 years ago, wasn't even in sort of the case capitalism makes 100 years ago. It was an accident of its time where the New York Stock Exchange started doing it and then forced companies to do it. And because the New York Stock Exchange is, or at least was then the major stock exchange, everybody else slowly followed that process. One example I do have in the book is of Unilever, which is a company that famously had Paul Polman come in and said, I am going to suspend quarterly financial projections because I think that drives short-term decision making. You're getting more of those examples happening. But to think about why we failed is, we could spend a lot of time looking at all the problems and how they exist. I will say the solution set to trying to overcome short-termism is there. We just need to tap more of it. So one other example is a lot of the large companies that need to be modified through this through the sort of short-term lens output, right? We're not talking about startups. Many of the startups have very different challenges. They're not really looking at short-term change. In fact, they get compared to the tech industry, which does have a much shorter cycle in investment. But now climate tech has come around and they recognize that you require more investment. So that's one place where I would say a lot of short-termism has been relatively overcome. But in large companies, there's still that because that's now the norm. However, most large companies are owned by pension funds or sovereign wealth funds. They make up a good chunk of 10, 20, 30% of every major company globally. And they are people who are supposed to have long-term answers to the capital that they have raised because they have my pension and I'm not retiring for 30 years. So they need to be pushing this much harder, and they are starting to because they realize that they have not yet given it the due it needs to. And as climate impacts start to become more extreme, their life only gets harder. So we are going to see much more pull of short versus long than we've had in the past. And that's a good place to be.
All right. Just a quick follow-up on that. There's a lot of us here on this call today, I'm sure, who'd like to participate or influence how fast capitalism adapts in the way that you just talked about. Any tips for us? Anything that we can do to make this transition into long-termism faster in some sense?
I think one of the things that people here on the call will probably have the most impact on immediately is if the companies they work for are places where they can go and ask what the companies are doing and why they're doing what they're doing. And it can start from the laundry list of things you can ask questions about is huge, but you could start with, what does the company do with its pensions plan? Where is it investing that money? What is it doing about a net zero plan and whether that net zero plan is science-based and how is it actually reducing emissions, not buying offsets? What is it doing about enabling employees to be able to be part of the net zero transition? Because, in different countries and different contexts, there are certain things that are just carbon intensive. In America, that's driving. What are you enabling to help employees cut their own emissions as they work for the company? So that probably is a very quick, not easy, but also but the quickest way in which you can do it. And we have seen examples of employees actually making very big change within companies. That's happened in Amazon, it's happened in Google. And then there are lots of places where it's quiet because it never made it to the public domain, where change happened internally. So that's probably the quickest. The other one is what you're doing, which is finding yourself in the transition where, if you are not already part of it, can you fit with your skill set? Everybody has a role, everybody has a place. Because it's messy and it will be for some time, that will mean you will have to struggle to find that place. But that struggle is worth it, especially if you're able to share what you learn with others so that the person doing it next year finds it easy.
Thank you, Akshat. That is great. Um, I also, a lot about, a lot of what you talk about in a book about the Indian context, right? This is something that I have also seen firsthand. There's this backdrop of, having to deal with weak institutions, right? And making change happen despite these weak institutions. Now, looking forward, we hope to see a bulk of development spending over the next few decades in the global south. And there are probably many countries with weak or inefficient institutions, government within the global south. Any lessons from your experiences, maybe covering China, India, and other
Yep.
places?
Weak institutions, especially developing countries, especially in places which are carbon intensive and will remain for some time because that's their right to be, but that's also the most efficient way in which they will grow, are places that the energy transition is right now failing. Not because those countries don't want clean air and clean water and clean energy, but because they can't afford it. And so you need a lot more capital moving. And the reason some of that capital, probably a large chunk of that capital, doesn't move is because of weak institution, weak governance. There are ways to overcome it. A chapter in the book is looking at the International Energy Agency, which is among a handful of very important international bodies that take examples of countries doing something right and then trying to deploy it somewhere else. So an Indian example is in India, energy efficiency is like a no-brainer. If you can save energy, you'll save money, and everybody wants to save money. Except you as an industry trying to do energy efficiency have an upfront cost. And if you do that in the short term, your competitor will have a cheaper uh, bike to sell or cheaper glass to make. And so you can't afford to do it. So what the Indian government ended up doing is creating an energy efficiency cap and trade system. Really, it's just certificates that are traded, like the emissions trading system in Europe. And that's worked like a charm. It spread very quickly. Now everybody has to do the investments, so nobody's sort of going out and losing their competitiveness. So there are ways in which, despite weak institutions, this came out of sort of uh, you know, thinking by bureaucrats, which made just financial sense. And so even though there are weak institutions and even though there is corruption, when there is an actual clear economic incentive done in a structural way, you can deploy it. And we see those examples. Can we fix politics everywhere right now to help work on the climate problem? Would be nice, but it's going to be no, it's not going to happen. So you got to learn from how you can deploy the solution despite those challenges.
All right. Um, okay. One more question I had was about innovation. And in your book, you talk about innovation and investments that we need to see in the future for the recipe that you talk about for countering climate change to be successful. Um, we need a lot of investment coming in and a huge amount of innovation still yet to come, right? Just an example, in the energy storage sector alone, and again, this is coming from your book, we need battery recycling to scale up. We need mines in safer locations with stronger environmental and human rights standards. You mentioned us needing breakthroughs in battery technology to get the energy storage cost to fall to 1/10 of current levels, even from current levels. Now, what gives you confidence that what we just talked about now, or many more such innovations, this is not just a wish list, but it's actually a concrete list of development actions that will get actioned upon?
Yes. So a couple of things, just looking at long-term trends, right? A lot of the technologies that we are taking advantage of now took a while to get going. I go into the solar story in the book, and really it was invented in 1839. Even the modern silicon solar cell was invented in 1950. So it took 70 years to be able to do what it's done. And yet there is an explosion, there's an exponential growth in this century, right? So it sort of trundled along till there was an actual incentive structure, both economic initially through policy and now just financial, for it to move. And so when you do that, you get innovation through the sheer dint of doing something multiple times again and again. But the kind of innovation you're talking about, which is step change, where you need to completely rethink something that needs to be done, is much harder. Now, battery recycling doesn't actually fall in that category. We know how to do it. We just need to make it cheaper. So that's a much different kind of innovation. But yes, low cost energy storage, building a battery that would be 1/10 or 1/20 at the price of current batteries is much harder, and we don't have all the answers for it yet. Again, what gives me confidence is that typically when we have chosen a particular problem, we have found the solutions we need. Again, it might take a little bit of time for them to come along, but I'll take an example of oil, right? So until about the start of 2000, there was really no substitute for what oil could do um, globally for all the many things it does. It does road transport, shipping, aviation, but it also does plastics and chemicals, and it does, asphalt. You really did not have any solution. Today, you can be very confident that about 45% of oil can be replaced or substituted for through electrification of transport, because 45% is your road transport consumption. What you're less confident about now is aviation, shipping, chemicals, and other uses. But we haven't really explored those solutions yet. We haven't actually done very much on sustainable aviation fuels. We haven't actually looked at, green methanol for shipping. Once we start doing that, we will see if we can make that change in 20 years in the 45%. Then there is scope, at least, it's not to go to 0%, to attack a big chunk of that. And so, again, like I sort of, in this regard, this very specific regard, do buy what Bill Gates says. He says it in the book. He says it externally, which is that innovation is one thing that he can be confident, even though he doesn't know specifically where the solution will come from, what the solution will be, but that if you spend the money and the time, you will almost always find some answer.
Okay, that's good to hear. I also definitely wanted to ask you about capitalism's poor track record on equity and justice, right? So we've seen increasing economic inequality around the world. The poor is facing increasingly dire consequences of the actions of the privileged few, and climate change is a great example of this problem. How do you see this aspect of capitalism being fixed in the future?
Yeah, and those are all good things that we need to fix right away. But those are also, many of those things are essentially things that we've been trying to fix even before climate change even was a problem, right? We grew up in India, where colonialism sort of hangs over almost everything that exists or could have existed but doesn't exist in India, right? Same thing with gender equity, same thing with racial equity. These are problems that existed, will exist. Hopefully we solve them very quickly. The thing why focusing on climate is interesting is that if you don't address climate change, all of those things actually get worse. You're already starting to see global hunger go up. This was pre-pandemic. You are starting to see poverty levels go up because of mostly COVID recently, but then energy prices because of volatile fossil fuels. And so the macro trends are actually going in reverse from what we would think of as progress.
It's you.
Hi, somebody needs to mute. So you are already starting to see reversal in that in sort of macro metrics, which you don't want. But it's also easy to just lose yourself in, well, this is all capitalism's fault. And so until we solve capitalism, none of those other problems will be solved. Well, that's not true, because we are seeing deployment of solar, wind, and batteries, and we are seeing avoided emissions, not in the offsets term, but actual sort of like going from a 4 degree Celsius world to a 3 degree Celsius world in the economic system that we have today. But you're also seeing acknowledgement of justice issues, of equity issues in at least Western countries. The Inflation Reduction Act has a number of policies that are very clearly, squarely aimed at that. Same is true with the European Green Deal. But on a macro level, one way or the only way we can reach net zero is if we actually have some equity baked into the solution. Because if you're going to move to renewable energy, you're going to move away from concentrated fossil fuels that are typically not mined and consumed in the countries that are developing. India doesn't have that much oil or gas. It does have some coal, but that's about it. And so when India builds solar, it builds distributed energy that has equity built into it. And that's true of other situations. And so, you know, even as I focus on climate change, one thing that I feel like we underappreciate is the sustainable development goals. These sort of seem like jargony. There are like 17 of these, they're different colors. And if you look at them, it's just a big laundry list of, wouldn't it be wonderful to solve all these problems? But that's sort of undermines how well thought out they are and how intertwined they are in trying to address all the complicated issues we face in the world and how equity is baked into trying to solve them. So no, we're not going to get an equal world at the end of this, but we will get a more equal world if we actually reach net zero.
Amen to that. Um, One question about our meaning humanity's outlook towards nature. It kind of seems like we've come to regard nature and our planet not as an ecosystem of which we are a part, but as a resource base for us to exploit. Now, do you think we can deal with climate change without us having to change this outlook at all?
What do you mean by resources consumed? Because in fact, today we are consuming way more resources than we would in a net zero world. So if you look at just the volume of resources, fossil fuels are 10 to 100x in volume in how much we mine today compared to the metals that we're going to need in the energy transition. So I'm curious what you mean by resources, because that's a big word.
No, absolutely, and that was a great example of how the green transition might make things better or easier. But I'm more talking about the outlook that we have, like for example, towards economic growth. There's an engine which drives that growth, and that engine is based on consumption, and that consumption leads to resource depletion somewhere, and none of those resources are infinite, right? We're depleting a finite resource, anything that we do today. So do you think that fundamental fact of how humanity works today has to change in the future, or do you think we can keep going in just the way we have
Well,
been?
it's already starting to change, right? Yes, GDP, which is the metric that drives economic growth as it's counted, is tied to consumption because that's what it does. It does gross domestic product, like three terms that you never want to read about. You don't want to read anything about gross. You don't, you rarely care about domestic issues that way. And product is just the biggest term that there can be. And yet GDP drives economic growth as we count it. But the best answer I've been actually given is that in a way, GDP is the cheat code that economists use. Is the thing we can measure, is the thing that we can measure because we can attach money to something. And because we can attach money to it, we've been measuring it. We haven't done the hard work. In some places, we've started to do it, of actually being able to measure beyond what money can count. So two things that happened recently. If you've come across this in your coursework, there was the Nicholas Stern report that came out in the UK in 2007, which made a very clear case, the sort of case that I make in the one sentence, which is it's just cheaper now to save the world than destroy it. Nicholas Stern was the first person to make it in a very systematic manner. There was a different report that came more recently, the Dasgupta review. And the Dasgupta review, again from the UK, is looking at how to value nature in the way that it should actually be valued. So we are starting to finally do the work of trying to measure things that matter, not just measure things that are easy to measure. But again, it's the question of timeline. Will we be able to do it as quickly as possible? It's hard to imagine that'll happen because it is just hard. It's not easy and it's complicated. But that shouldn't stop us from working on the solution. So again, it's easy to sort of give up the solutions we have, waiting for the perfect one. The good thing is we have good enough ones that we can actually start deploying.
All right. Okay, so I'm actually going to change gears a little bit here. I mean, we've been talking about your book so far, and I can't wait for everyone here to read the book. But I also wanted to delve a little bit into your background, for our fellows and unpack that a little bit. You are a role model for many of us here. So could you kind of briefly describe your background and how you transitioned into covering climate change and sustainability as a journalist? What motivated you, and how did you reach where you are today?
Yeah, I grew up in India. I took sort of the route that many Indian kids take, which is if you're good at science, you do either engineering or medicine. I chose engineering. But then I went to an institute in India which was focused on research. So I ended up, being surrounded by people who wanted to do research. And so that's when I applied for a PhD and did a PhD in chemistry at Oxford. But I was sort of set on becoming a professor at that time. But during the PhD, I kind of realized that, especially the Indian education system, is very blinkered, which is not to say it's not good. It's very focused on a very specific outcome that you get a job at the end of it and you make money. Um, Going to Oxford was, a revelation in that, like, oh, there are all these other things I would like to be interested in and I would like to learn about. And so I gave up on the professorial route, and then I used to write as a hobby and just thought, okay, well, what's the best way in which I can continue to learn without having to do another PhD because I didn't want to do that. And journalism felt like the nicest place. And I got lucky to get an internship at The Economist, and then I've been a journalist ever since that time. Um, I started writing about climate in 2016, 17 when Donald Trump was campaigning to be president. And my editors were like, well, he's talking about this thing called clean coal. What is it? And it sort of married chemistry and chemical engineering, which is carbon capture technologies. And I was like, all right, I'm going to explore what this thing is and how it's been around for 50 years and it has all these climate uses if you actually deploy it, and yet nobody is deploying it. And so that's how I started covering climate. And since then, I've been on the sort of beat, which now I define as solutions and false solutions. So what works and why it works, and what doesn't work and why it doesn't work. Yeah.
All right. Any specific advice for fellows who aspire to pursue careers in climate journalism or related fields? Any skills, qualities, anything that you feel valuable?
Curiosity and ability to write and persistence, because it's not a field that has a very good economic model. There you go. It's not, if capitalism worked perfectly, the journalism probably wouldn't exist. And so you need to support, the business model is sort of messed up as is. And so you need to be careful about whether you are willing to make the sacrifices that you will if you work in this industry, and be realistic about how easy it will be to move into this industry, regardless of what skills that you have.
Okay. All right. Just one more question from me before we move on to audience Q&A. And this is a little bit about, climate change communications as a journalist, or even in, life in general. It can be pretty polarizing. Like, it's pretty hard to bring this topic up in many different geographies in the world, even today. So
Yeah.
how do you approach discussions with skeptics, deniers, what have you? And, what strategies can some of us learn from?
I find the most interesting way in which I've been able to stay sane and continue this is to be open to opposing ideas, but not to be focused on trying to dismiss bad ideas, or trying to focus on how to overcome climate denialism or climate delays. And um, you don't feed the troll, so to speak, in the sort of internet speak that, and it works. So there is just so much to do constructively, positively, uh, and so much to find out as a journalist, to so many stories to tell, that it's actually not that hard to stay away from the polarization. I don't live in America. I don't envy my American colleagues. That's probably the most sort of polarizing climate debate there is, but that exists now a little more in the UK, that exists in Australia. In other places, it's not as polarizing. Right? In India, climate change is actually not talked about. It's not a polarizing issue. It's not being talked about. So in most of the world, actually, climate is not being talked about. There are some pockets where it is polarizing, but there's a whole world outside it.
All right, thank you, Akshat. So I am actually now going to move towards audience Q&A, and there's a whole long bunch of questions. So I'm going to try to pick a few based on the themes that we've talked about so far. Fellows from the Elephants and Fossas cohort, you can still go over to Slido and put your questions in. The link to the Slido was shared on Slack before the talk. All right, the first one, and which has got most upvotes, within the climate community, how do we unite those who believe we need financial systems change and those who believe we can win with capitalism? How do we unite all of these forces together?
I don't know. I'm not a campaigner. I don't run an NGO. I don't run political campaigns. I don't know I don't know how to unite people. What I can say is there isn't one narrative that will win over everybody. It's not going to work. We are many different people with many different experiences, whether we are in a single country or not. And so the best solution I've had, and again, it'll sound like a cop out, but it's not, which is, journalism is a reflection of society, and journalism follows the narratives that exist in society. Some narratives are worthy of exploration, some are not. So there's a little bit of selection that journalists have to do, but not one thing is going to unite anybody, and I don't know if that's an aim that's even worthy of pursuing. So, there is David Wallace Wells' book, The Uninhabitable Earth, really good literature to read about how horrible the future is going to be. And then you have my book, which is looking at, all right, it's going to be horrible, but we can make it less horrible. Here are all the ways in which successes look. Now, you can call his book pessimistic, mine optimistic, but I think that's losing the value of what these books are, which is they're giving you two narrative strands of realities that exist in our current present, and both have, I hope, value for society.
All right. A few people are asking this, curious about your take on natural carbon removal solutions, for example, biochar, and from a science perspective, business, ability to scale, fundraising, right? All of those perspectives put
Yeah.
together. Yeah.
I have been actually surprised by how much interest both carbon offsets and carbon removal have shown in the minds of very smart people, in the minds of people putting money towards it. When in reality, the numbers that we need for carbon removal are going to be decades out. And there is just so much more to be done on the current mitigation technologies and methods and processes. And, we sort of don't focus enough on them. And so, we could do a whole class just looking at what all the different carbon removal technologies do, but I don't think if you're looking at it from a macro picture, which is what I'm hoping this conversation is about, how to tackle climate change and cut emissions fast, carbon removals are important, but not as important as everything else we can talk about.
All right. And a related question on inevitably carbon offsets. Is it one big BS or does it even make sense in some cases?
Well, again, it's one that I've probably spent irrationally more of my time than I really need to. One way I think about it is today it's a $2 billion market, but probably $100 billion worth of intellectual capacity is spent on it. And the history of it, which one really good place to hear it is in a conversation I had with Mark Trexler, who started the very first carbon offset project in 1988. It's on my podcast Zero if you search for Trexler. And basically, the shortest way I can explain it, and the shortest way Mark explained it to me, is that people with mostly the right intention, wanting to do the right thing, stuck in an incentive system which is not capitalistic, which is completely based on voluntary contributions and aimed at reputational gain rather than actually doing anything about climate, that causes them to fail. So could there, in theory, be a really good carbon offset project that would raise a forest or protect one, help communities with the financing from the money raised for the offsets? No doubt, it's possible. Have we found one that works after doing hundreds of them around the world, or some estimate thousands? I haven't found one. I'd be up for looking for one, but I've looked at so many now that I don't feel like it's an economic. It's a system that will get easily fixed. And again, going back to the same problem, there are so many other things on mitigation that you can spend your time on much more productively in actually making tons of emissions reduced. Much better to focus on that.
All right, that was pretty clear. Um, do developing countries still need to be convinced that climate solutions benefit their economy, or are we already there? What do you feel?
No, they need to be convinced still, and it's getting worse in some places where it's not just about mitigation technologies. It's like they actually just need to adapt to climate change now, and this is true of some of the island nations, some of the sort of some of the poorest countries. For them, it's no longer about whether climate change is here and we should do something about it. It's like climate change is here and we cannot do anything about it because we don't have the money. So no, the economic case needs to be made and made stronger, and it can only be made if there is money being transferred, not as a grant, but actual investors from rich countries investing money in developing countries. And that bridge, that is one solution that doesn't exist in my book because it doesn't exist in the world. And if somebody can work on that problem, that's going to be the problem that'll move the most amount of emissions tons reduced over the next decade. How to help finance climate solutions in developing countries.
All right. Another question regarding or related to governments. How do you get governments over short-termism when the priority is just getting re-elected at the next elections?
This is where the sort of political narrative is very interesting. So recently I spoke to Navroz Dubha. She's a professor in Delhi about thinking about what really will have an impact at COP28. And turns out, as you might have followed from sort of COP conversations, all these people meet thousands, tens of thousands for a 2-week period, which is a very intense, long period. And then seems like no progress has been made. They'll talk about something to do with fossil fuel phase out or something to do with like tripling renewable energy capacity, which is what might be the thing this year. And nothing moves. And Navroz basically says that all climate policies are actually local. And you, as a politician who wants to do anything about climate, must recognize that there are different stories to be told to different audiences. And that is not to be duplicitous, not to lie, but that there are advantages that will be appealing to local audiences that will not be appealing to global audiences. Reducing air pollution in Delhi with electric cars is a good thing. It doesn't matter whether they are powered by coal or not. Yes, they actually reduce CO2 emissions even if they're powered by coal, but kind of secondary. But from a global perspective, India can go, we're going to reduce air pollution in our cities by electrifying our fleet. And here is our electrification story to a global audience. So there are ways in which you can essentially find the co-benefits that exist in many of these solutions to tell the audience that matters, to bring as much unity as you can in politics.
All right. And since you mentioned COP, I was going to ask you this later towards the end, but what would you like to see coming out from this COP next month?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't. I do not have desire of what COP needs to do. The only desire, if I have a desire as a journalist, is we should reduce emissions in the most sensible way, fastest way possible, while helping people transition in the nicest way possible. So I don't know. COP28 is, I can tell you what the presidency wants. As I said, they want this tripling of renewable energy coming in as a statement signed off by all countries. They want the pledge of $100 billion from developing countries to developed countries finally being met, that they say, yes, this is now happening. And then they want the loss and damage fund, which is a fund to try and help developing countries deal with the damages of climate change. Operationalized means many things, pretty vague, but in some form having some understanding of where the money is going to come from and who will get it and how it will be given out. If those three things happen, I mean, from a global sort of moving the ball forward, it's good progress. But what really makes a difference, what this COP is going to be about, is the global stocktake, which is what have countries done in policies so far to reduce emissions, and what are they going to do over the next 5 years? And that is down to climate policies domestically. So that's the sort of Nowruz Dubash argument, which is good to have COP meetings, great to have global conversations, but you've got to go home and do the hard work. It's hard work for 50 weeks, and 2 weeks you have to come and show what your hard work has been.
All right. Now I know there is a lot about this next question in your book, but I'm going to ask you this anyway. So, what are examples of policy or governance, successfully influencing climate capitalism?
Yes. So a really good set is to look at what the UK has done, which right now may not sound like a shining example of a climate forward country with a prime minister that is trying to create culture wars, but it still stands. The case that I make in the book actually stands, and I can come to it towards the end of the answer. But basically, what the UK has done is probably one of the most systematic approaches to try and tackle climate change. So it got this Climate Change Act, which is the story in the book of how it came about. It was created in 2008, and it does a very interesting thing. It clearly defines what the UK needs to do every 5 years through what is a carbon budget, and that carbon budget declines as you get to net zero. And it empowers a independent body called the Climate Change Committee to make sure that it advises government on what policies and strategies it has available on an annual basis. So it updates its own technology profile, it updates its own understanding of policy experiments outside the UK, and what are the best things that government can do. And then not just provide them with a strategy document, it also does assessment of whether the government is actually doing any of those things. And so it's a very powerful tool to not just have a law that every party has agreed on, but also to have an independent body check on you whether you're doing it. And a third thing that doesn't exist in the UK, which Nowruz Dubash pointed out should exist as a perfect mix of policies, is what South Africa has, which is called the Presidential Commission on Climate Change. And it basically is a forum where all the people who will be affected, both positively and negatively, by the energy transition, get to come talk about how the policies that the government is thinking about is going to play out for them, and use the learnings from those forums to actually inform policy. So it's sort of nerdy stuff, but it's also not that complicated. A good act, a good regulator, a good independent, not regulator, a good independent body, and a forum for people to actually exchange their views honestly.
All right. Last couple of questions, Akshat, and I almost missed this one, but I think this is important for me to ask you. Where do you stand on the green growth versus degrowth debate?
Again, I don't know if I have an ideological stance on it. What I can see is that conventional economic wisdom, which is what dictates the world as it runs, says growth is what's going to help you tackle many of the problems that world faces. I have lived through a period where I have benefited from that economic growth as an Indian growing up in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. India came and really, its economic growth in that period benefited so many people. I've seen that firsthand. Is that the only way in which to solve the problem? Probably not. But what do we have that is working, can work, can be made to work? Is probably green growth, is probably climate capitalism. We do have a deadline to run. That's where I am. So it's not sort of an ideological stand. It's sort of like a pragmatic position to be in, which is what can we do in the time we have?
All right. And just the last one for you. Given the current state of where we are at, what message of hope or optimism would you like to leave with us as we?
Well, again, this is one of those things where I don't have an optimistic or a hopeful thing. If I would say read the book, I mean, if that is probably the thing that will give you the best understanding, I feel like the thing that I would want people most to take away is that try and inform yourself about the reality of where we are in the nicest, clearest, simplest way that you can. Read a lot of different sources, read a lot of good books, and then find yourself in how you can be part of the solution mix. So what I can say is that lots of people are doing it, and my job is only getting easier. Writing this book actually became easier. I didn't have to go and make a case for climate capitalism. I just had to tell the stories of how it was happening. And I didn't have to go and find the people that were doing it. They were all around me. I just have to actually have to choose whose story I tell and why. And so that to me is, if you want to take the hopeful, optimistic message, that's the one. But really, it's more just be much more aligned with what the reality is, and be much more pragmatic about how we can go about deploying solutions.
All right, Akshat, thank you. Firstly, of course, for all your work researching and telling us all these wonderful stories, and also clearly showing us a path of what is necessary and what is possible through your book as well.
Yeah, and I will say I'm very interested. One of the reasons why I wrote the book was I learn by doing the work I do, which is journalism. And I do that, and the way I do it is by talking to people and learning from them. So I put my email in there. It's also available online. I hope you will read the book. Please engage with me. Write to me about what you think, what works, why it doesn't work, where I was wrong. Very happy to learn about being wrong and trying to figure out how to do this job better. I think there is now a big mass of audience that cares about this, and it's growing, and that's a good place to be. And we can all make each other better by good constructive conversations.
Thank you, Akshat. Thank you for the openness, and also for being here today for the session, explaining so many really complex concepts to us in such elegant language. Audience, thank you for being here today, and also for the questions. I could see a lot of engagement on the chat as well, people asking questions and answering them, so that was great. If you haven't already, please do check out the Learning for Action course. And also, as Akshat pointed out, his book is out, so please check that out as well. Thanks for coming, and hope to see you at more events like this one. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you for having me, and thanks Terra.do for what you do. It's very important.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Is there a survey? Is there a survey? Is there a survey?
No, not really.
No, sir. Wonderful. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll make sure to write in how great it was. Thanks so much.